Cars are, I know where it is. Anyway, on to the rest of the talk here, which is the more important part. Bilge graduated from HCII 2009. Was a PhD. He was already doing really great stuff in HRI before he left. He went off to Wisconsin, where he's continued to do really great stuff. So those of us in the HRI community get to see this stuff on a somewhat annual basis. So it's an opportunity for the rest of you to see all the cool stuff that's been going on in his lab, along with some of his collaborators. So I'm not going to waste any more time. Go for it.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you for the introduction, Aaron. So I have the privilege of giving my third important talk in this room. I proposed in this room and I defended in this room. And my advisor is actually attending all three. It's great. So it's great to be back here. So what I want to talk about today is basically what I've been doing in the last 5 years since I graduated. And I'm going to talk about the main theme of that, which is building human-centered methods and principles for design robotic products. Okay. So I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about kind of robots as products, right? Not as things that we are all kind of really interested in and excited about for various reasons, but more products for end users as consumer products, and why we need to kind of worry about a human-centered approach for designing these products. So robots have been a part of culture for centuries, right? So we look at back in kind of history, art, media, we see this vision of robots that are helpful, that help, that are useful, doing a lot of useful work. At the same time, the last 50 years, we've seen tremendous advances in robotics, very sophisticated robot system doing very useful work, but they mostly do this in kind of, inside cages, dark factories, and so on. And what's really exciting is that in the last decade or two, we see this vision for robots and these very sophisticated advancements come together and introduce robotic technology in sort of day-to-day end-user products. And we're kind of starting to see glimpses of that. And these products include products designed for delivery, for indoor and outdoor cleaning, communication products used in domestic, medical, professional, industrial settings. We also see products that help people monitor their health and well-being, offer them companionship, motivation, help them learn. And robots, again, in manufacturing, but this time, robots that interact with people and collaborate with them in kind of a peer-to-peer capacity. We even see robotic features being sort of introduced into very conventional products, from wooden toys to pet feeders and car lift gates and baby swings and things like that. And just in the past several months, we've seen major investments in kind of corporate investment into robotics, which I think kind of is a sign that a lot of exciting things are about to happen in this area. And to me, just sort of the change from sort of cage monster robots to something that you put your baby in is already a sign of that transformation. So these products actually point at kind of this tremendous opportunity for designing new products, products that help people, and also kind of a market for all of this technology. And what's most interesting and exciting to me about this is that these products actually afford very unique interactions and sort of pose very unique design challenges, very complex design challenges. So about 8 years ago, my advisors and I decided to take a look at one of these products that was actually one of the very few instances of such products out in the real world working. We wanted to get a better understanding of, so how do people interact with these, and what are they like? You might be very familiar with this product. Its manufacturer is a Pittsburgh-based company. But this was a product called Tug that made deliveries in a hospital. When I say deliveries in a hospital, it wasn't delivering babies. It was making deliveries, from the nurses' stations to the lab and that kind of thing. So this product had been out at about 100 hospitals at the time, which is, amazing. 8 years ago, 100 hospitals using these robots. The hospital that I studied this in had 7 of these products, and they had been using it for 3 years. Okay, so I'm going to show you a brief video of this, and I'll talking about sort of the different functionality it has. There you go. So the robot moved autonomously in the hospital. It made deliveries from one unit to the other. It would deliver blood samples from a nurse's station to the lab. It might take dirty linen from patient rooms down to laundry. In the meantime, it operated elevators, doors, navigated in the hallways all autonomously, and sometimes it interacted with people, sometimes in undesirable ways, and sometimes in desirable ways. And after months of observations and interviews with people, what I learned was that Tug was a success in many dimensions. Okay, so the robot was getting work done. The hospital management was very happy. The product itself was selling. But it was kind of less successful in other aspects. So when I talked with people who actually interacted with the robot on a kind of a day-to-day basis on the hospital floor, they had a very different perspective. They would say, whatever they said all kind of boiled down to the following. They found the robot to lack social skills. So this was a real surprise. Of course, for us, it was an amazing finding. But at the time, we were surprised that they were talking about social skills and manners and respect and things like that. And they're talking about a robot, right? So that was definitely novel. And when we think about a hospital environment, these things actually mattered a lot, right? People had a very stressful job. They were caring for patients with cancer, and they expected that not only people they interacted with, but also the products they interacted with followed the same courtesy and the rules and the norms of the environment that they were in. So here's a unit director talking about how the robot doesn't have the social norms that they taught children, right? And when the robot kind of failed to follow these social norms, it really hurt user experience. So here a nurse is asking the robot, basically yelling the robot, "Can't you see that I'm on the phone?" Right? This is not something a robot can determine, but I had this expectation that it should follow this professional courtesy and norms. So some people got so upset with this hurt user experience that they would abandon using the product, which caused all sorts of problems in the workflow of the hospital management. So our main conclusion was that robotic products that are placed in the human environment should be following the norms, professional and social, of that environment. And what was really interesting about this is that if any of you have been to a hospital recently, it's full of technology. It's, cutting edge, full top-of-the-line technology. But no one had similar expectations from other forms of technology that they had with this robot, right? So when we went back to the manufacturer of the robot, what we learned, it became clear to us that they had a lot of stuff about the robot right. They got that right. They got the security right, the ergonomics was okay, and the industrial design was good. But they really didn't expect that people would have these expectations of norms and professional courtesy and things like that. And of course, we don't know how to design these norms into robots, and they didn't know either. So it was very clear what was missing and what had to be done. Or at least, what problem had to be addressed. So at the time, the manufacturer looked at these problems. They made a lot of improvements. So the product definitely went further and got much better. But for us, the main conclusion was that creating robotic products actually requires kind of a more unique design approach, and then we know very little about what approach to take here. So. And this product was kind of the inflection point for me to kind of come up with this idea that creating robotic products requires kind of this human-centered approach, methods, and knowledge in order to make them successful. So for the last 5 years, I've been building a research program around building human-centered methods and tools for designing these products. So what I'll be talking about today is that there are 3 threads of research that we follow. And that are guided by 3 different research questions. The first one is, what's the design space for robots, right? Robotic products. Here, our goal is to really create kind of knowledge and guidelines that will guide the designers down the road to create these products. The second one is, how do we support the design process of such products? So here we want to develop methods and tools that facilitate the process. And the last one is, how do we actually apply this knowledge and the tools and the methods to real-world products, maybe not today, but down the road, inform kind of what's happening with real products. So what I'd like to do today is to kind of give examples of each thread of work and kind of give sort of a sense of what are the kinds of problems that we work on. Okay, so to start with the first one, what's the design space for social robots, right? What does a designer actually design when they have to design social, social robots or robotic products? And how do we explore this design space? The way that we decided to follow this research question was, well, how do we explore this design space? The best way to explore is by designing, right? Can we actually design, repeatedly design lots of different, for different problems such that we can actually kind of explore the space as we move forward? So talking about kind of designing robotic products that follow human social norms, if we actually break this down into some kind of task, what are the things, tools, and methods that we need to use here, we're actually talking about some aspect of design that we're going to employ design knowledge, design methods. We need some aspect of computation, system building, engineering that we have to deal with. And at the end, we need to know a little bit about behavioral science because we want to look at people both kind of before you design a product and after you design the product. And overall, this is kind of a very interdisciplinary research space. So what we do is we put this into a design framework of analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, where we employ kind of behavioral science methods of what's called microanalysis, looking at things in depth and understanding kind of the resource for design. Then we go into design and computer scientific methods to synthesize some kind of design that we want to create. And at the end, we want to evaluate that again using behavioral science methods of experimentation. So I'm going to give you examples of what I mean by these so that it's more clear. So running through this process one more time, we first look at human behavior very closely to see, how people behave and how can we design off of that. So often this involves, bringing people in a lab, observing them as they perform certain, tasks and in interactions. And when we do this with the sort of the rigor of the behavioral sciences, right? We look at a large number of people. We take into account things like, gender. When men talk to men, they talk differently than when women talk to women. So we look at factors like that. Then we use a blend of kind of behavioral, heuristic, and computational methods to analyze what these behaviors look like, right? So we might look at, the timing of when someone speaks and nods and smiles and things like that. And this analysis can get really kind of costly, so we use kind of automated methods as much as we can, but supplement that with kind of hand coding and things like that. Then we use these models and patterns to synthesize behaviors for robots for interaction. And at the end, this is an example of a behavior that we have designed. And let me plug this in. Just to show you something really tiny that a robot might do. No, not yet. There isn't that much voice. I can just play it off of that. OK. Here's a robot following a very small kind of synthesis rules to actually display some kind of small amount of behavior.
Could you help me put the green object with one peg into the red box, please?
So once we have synthesized behavior, we go back to some of those sort of theories and observations we do in humans to test certain kind of theories of what we expect from these interactions and test certain hypotheses. Okay? So next I'm going to give you examples of this, but this sets up kind of this research and design process framework for that. Okay. So if we look at some of the emerging products today and imagine an interactive social robot that serves as an educational assistant, or a flying robot that makes deliveries, or a robotic communication product that connects people, the question is, what are the design spaces for that? So in the examples I'll present, I'll focus on these three platforms. So talking about sort of social robots, the design space for social robot, and it was partly for the hospital delivery robot, is really defined by sort of the affordances of social interaction and human communication, right? So what are these affordances? And when we're, we can look at sort of the behavioral sciences to see what these affordances are. So when we look at this, we actually see that there is an extremely rich set of patterned behaviors that humans use in interaction. Okay? That might involve the use of gaze and gestures and posture and body orientation and proximity and speech and dialogue and that kind of thing. And when these behaviors are actually used effectively by humans, we see very powerful interaction outcomes, right? Such as a sort of a speaker using its gaze and gestures very efficiently to persuade its audience, which hopefully I'm doing right now. And back to the design space for social robots, these affordances actually make up this very rich design space, right? Which potentially has very significant design outcomes that we can try to achieve. For example, we can design the gestures of an educational agent such that it maximizes the learning of the students, right? So how do we actually do that? And in the sort of the last 5 years, we've created kind of a body of knowledge looking at all these different behavioral channels and design variables to create some of that basic knowledge. Okay, so I'm diving into an example now. So in this first example, what we wanted to do is exploring how a robot should maintain eye contact. Okay, so how much eye contact should a robot maintain? If it doesn't maintain eye contact all the time, when should it break eye contact, right? Very basic things like that. So if you look at the literature on human behavior, what you'll see that one of the things that they'll say is that more eye contact is better. Okay, my robot should build more eye contact. But then they will say 100% eye contact is not good because it'll make you look creepy. So should the robot build eye contact 50% of the time or 80% of the time? And if there's a 50% or 30% or 20% of not building eye contact, when should it be breaking eye contact, right? So we wanted to look at problems like this. So putting that into kind of that research framework that I showed before, we closely analyzed human behavior. We brought people in, had them do a lot of social scenarios, and looked at how people maintain eye contact. From there, we learned a lot about how much eye contact people maintain, also the patterns that they followed, under which conditions they broke their gaze versus they maintained eye contact and things like that, and what are the different forms in which they broke eye contact. Then we built these patterns into the gaze of a social robot, and at the end evaluated how people perceived it by testing certain predictions about it. So to give you a quick glimpse of what we actually designed, what the design behaviors look like, here one of the robots is going to answer the following question. How would you describe yourself?
I'm very social. I really enjoy meeting and working with a lot of different people.
So here the robot is producing what's called a cognitive gaze aversion, which is what people often, when they get a question, they think about their answer and then they respond. And in response, people think of the person as being more thoughtful, putting thought into their response, right? So this is sort of one of the very kind of small behaviors that are designed in this set of behaviors that we've designed. And then in the evaluation, we wanted to compare this to different kinds of baseline behaviors. Okay? So next one I'll show is what a badly timed cognitive gaze aversion would look like.
I'm very social. I really enjoy meeting and working with a lot of different people.
So the comparison with the badly timed one tells us whether the timing of this gaze aversion is important, right? Does it make a difference or not? And then another baseline was a robot with no gaze behavior.
I'm very social. I really enjoy meeting and working with a lot of different people.
Right, and the comparison here with the no gaze condition tells us whether these gaze aversions are important at all, right? Maybe the robot should just sit there, right? And when we look at sort of the experimental results, and I'm just giving you just one measure, one glimpse of the results, we see that when the robot actually does produce that gaze aversion, it actually looks more thoughtful, right, in its response. And you look at across different measures, this idea of averting your gaze has a huge impact compared to a robot that builds eye contact all the time. And if you go back to the original design question, we were talking about how much eye contact it should have. More eye contact was better, but it wasn't clear how it should work. So by looking at kind of analyzing human behavior closely, we were able to kind of extract the mechanisms that people use and be able to simulate and get sort of the effects that we predict based on literature of humans. Okay, so in the second example, I want to kind of focus on a slightly different aspect of interaction with these with social robots. We wanted to explore how robots could not only kind of display these well-timed behaviors, these effective behaviors, but also adapt these behaviors to changes in user states. Right? We wanted to kind of close the loop on human-robot interaction. So if you had an educational robot, for example, with a student who's not paying attention, what should the robot do? How should the robot adapt its behaviors to improve that person's, the student's attention, right? Which is exactly what we did. In our design, in our scenario, we developed a technique to monitor real-time user attention and detect lost attention and try to regain the student's attention by varying the robot's speech and gestures, right? That's what we were trying to do. And there are a lot of design challenges here, like capturing attention, right? But also knowing what to do, what behaviors to show, and understanding how should they be timed and things like that. So putting that back into that design framework I talked about earlier, we drew on research on educational psychology and an area called neuroergonomics to build a method for detecting lost user attention in real time and regain attention by changing how a robot behaved. We've actually patented this method and applied it to various different scenarios like MOOCs. It turns out that it can be used in a lot of different settings. Once we designed this robot that can adapt its behavior to varying attention levels, we evaluated that in an actual learning scenario with users. So in the evaluation, we compared the robot's adaptive behaviors. So this is the attention levels of an actual participant. The points are points of detected lost attention, and that's when the robot would produce an intervention which changes behavior to adapt it to the attention levels. We compared that to maladaptive behaviors, where the timing of the attention grabbing behaviors would be off, they were randomly determined, or no behaviors, right? We detect that there's a loss in attention, but I'm not going to do anything about it. And what we see is a huge improvement in learning measures, right? This is a number of correct answers people produced based on the story that they heard from the robot, the information they got from the robot, right? People did better in a test, a recall test afterwards when the adaptive interventions were presented, but the same thing was not achieved when it was maladaptive. Okay, so hopefully that gave you an idea of kind of the space of exploration and the design space for social robots. I want to kind of switch gears to flying robots. These are often called unmanned aerial vehicles. Flying robots, the general class of robots that have the ability to move in 6 degrees of freedom in human space or outdoors and things like that. So outlining the design space for social robots was rather straightforward, right? Let's look at human social behavior and use that as a resource. But what's the design space for a robot that freely flies in your environment, right? Can we use a fly as the model? Might not be a good idea. So what we did here is, we considered what do these motions look like? These proximal motions. Let's say that I have a robot here during my talk, comes into the room because it has to do these inspections, goes around, takes measurements and leaves. What do I feel about that robot? That robot comes in and actually does something here. And if I look at the interaction, what does that look like, right? So we took some of these interactions and decided to create certain kind of primitives out of those behaviors, right? So we broke down flight paths into a set of behavioral primitives, like approaching people, avoiding people, departing from a place. And these primitives are actual design variables that we can modify and alter to improve certain aspects of the communicatives of that behavior. And by creating these better behaviors, by altering, modifying them, we can actually make these robots to be more comfortable to be around, to have people feel safer and more usable and things like that. So the example I'll give here is, the same scenario, given this design space, how can we actually design robot motions that are perceived to be more natural and safer and more usable by observers, that are co-located observers. So again, we put this in the same research framework. What we did here was to apply some well-known character animation principles, such as arcing anticipatory behavior, easing in and out, to make the robot's behavior more readable by users. And we remember the different primitives that we extracted from flight paths. We modified the motion primitives by applying these principles on them to see which primitive actually most benefited, what kind of manipulation was actually most effective in improving the communicativeness of that primitive. Then we evaluated whether applying these modifications on the flight paths of the robot actually improved overall user experience. So to give you a kind of a sense of what these motions look like and the manipulations look like, I'm going to show you a few videos. The first one is what it looks like when there's no manipulation. It's just the standard motion that a flying robot would do. And when I'm doing that, I'd like you to watch my grad student's face. It's usually the experience you have when a robot is approaching you, right? You have no idea when it's going to stop, whether it's going to stop or not, and what it's going to do. So if I apply some of these manipulations on them, this is what anticipation looks like. This is what arcing looks like. And this is easing in and out. And when we combine these manipulations, you get a very different behavior. So in the final evaluation, what we did was we created two versions of the robot's overall flight task, right? So the robot had a bunch of targets that it had to follow. It either followed kind of the standard motion that would follow versus followed our manipulations to actually change the flight path. And what we found was that when it was modified in the way that we designed, it was actually perceived to be more usable and safer and things like that. Okay, so with social robots and flying robots, we're talking about systems and products that have some sense of autonomy and agency to them, right? With telepresence robots, we're actually talking about products that serve as kind of a medium for communication between different people, right? So these products are usually located in a local environment. Let's say that I have a collaborator over at MIT, and I have a robot here, so I want to talk to my collaborator. They log on to that robot, they roll over, come here, I have a conversation, and maybe they have another meeting, they go to another office, they attend the talk. So I become the local user, and my collaborator is a remote user using, moving in this local environment. And these are actually finding widespread use in a lot of different settings, medical, industrial, kind of production, corporate settings. And I think last year, the FDA actually approved its use at medical environments. And across the nation, there are doctors who actually do patient visits using these robots rather than actually personally showing up there. So this is actually kind of one of the robotic products that actually have really picked up and is going out there. So the design space for these products is also extremely rich, as you might imagine, right? We've outlined this space to have kind of physical aspects of it, behavioral aspects, such as its height, the motion it follows, its speed, screen size, and how it moves in the environment, what kind of control interface the system it has, how much autonomy it might have versus whether it's completely teleoperated and that kind of thing. And by designing these elements well, we might actually be able to kind of facilitate better collaboration between these remote people who are trying to use this product to communicate and collaborate. So we've done, again, a number of studies in this area, kind of exploring different aspects of that. And the example I want to give today is, what happens if the robot is at different heights? What's the right height for a robotic product? Right? So sort of the question that we had, what's the right height for a telepresence robot and how that might change based on the setting that you're in. So this was, I'm just going to touch on this very quickly. What we did is that we identified different heights for a robot. We made it either short and tall, and we gave people communicating via the robot different roles. They were either supervisors or subordinates. And what we found was that when the remote user was a supervisor, being on the short robot really hurt their authority, okay? And overall collaboration. And this actually has a lot of implications. It kind of sounds funny, but when you think about situations where positions of authority is important, right? Think about situations where using authority to improve compliance is really important, such as doctor-patient communication. Thinking about those findings, what you need to do is very clear here, right? The doctor has to be a tall robot. So I think exploring the design space gives you kind of these very clear guidelines on what should be designed and what designs are expected to be successful. Okay, so that's sort of the work that kind of is on outlining the design space through a series of studies, kind of mapping it out so that we create knowledge about that design space, the design variables, how they're going to be successful, and things like that. But that's all nice and great. But like I said, designing for the space is actually a very complex task because we're talking about not a salt shaker, but a very complex computational system that makes inferences about its environment and its users and adapts to it and all that, right? We're talking about something very sophisticated. So how do we actually help designers design for these products, right? And how do we help us who's exploring this space do that exploration better? So in the second thread of work, we're doing a lot of work to improve the methods and tools that are available to us in designing such products. So we've built a number of tools and methods, and I'll be presenting 3 of them that map onto those 3 stages of the process that I talked about before. Okay, so I'll be giving 3 examples that help us kind of analyze and model human behavior. Methods and tools on how we can actually use these models to synthesize robot behaviors, and designers can actually synthesize behaviors for robot applications. And the third one is how do we actually evaluate kind of design behaviors in a very complex design space, right? When you have lots of different variables, that idea of I'm going to compare good timing to bad timing might not actually work, right? So how do we actually address that problem? Okay, so I'm going to start with analysis, and we'll go through those different stages. So the main task in this stage of the design process is to characterize some form of behavior. It could be human behavior, it could be a living or non-living organism or things behavior like animated characters, but we're trying to capture something that we don't know much about in a way that we can simulate later, right? So how do we learn about something and translate this characterization into robots? And if you think about a scenario for this, so imagine that we'd like to kind of analyze and model the verbal and nonverbal behaviors of a storyteller or a lecturer, right? So this process of starting from observation of people and ending with kind of an implementation of robots conventionally has a number of steps in it, at least conventionally in the way that designers and behavior scientists have approached this problem. And this process usually involves annotating data on human interactions, right? You take this data, go through that, analyze it, sort of annotate it, label it as you go through that data. Then we do some kind of characterization of data. We might look at certain patterns in which different behaviors happen. We might look at distributions of co-occurrence and things like that. And represent this characterization in some kind of algorithm that a robot can execute, okay? So this process actually works fairly well, as you've seen in the design space exploration work. But when we're talking about a process like that, when we're talking about very large data sets, when we're talking about a very large number of behaviors, this becomes very costly, particularly the annotation process is very costly, and also sort of the characterization, representation, modeling process is also very costly. And like I said, we use a lot of automated methods to kind of capture and label things as much as we can, but there are certain limitations there. And the question that we asked in this project was, can we actually learn these representations from annotated or automatically or manually annotated data so that at least we can reduce the cost of modeling that? And also, we can scale it to kind of larger data sets and things like that. So if you think about that storytelling scenario, we wanted to model the patterns among speech, gaze, and gestures, okay? And decided to sort of learn these patterns using a dynamic Bayesian network. And we created a network structure based on what we learned from human communication about sort of how certain cognitive processes actually drive these kinds of behaviors. So the way that we created the network structure was that there was an underlying cognitive process that drives all behaviors across these channels. And the speech has a particular effect on gaze and gesture. So this is sort of the network structure that we created. We then created sort of a dynamic network at discrete time intervals of 500 milliseconds. And that was empirically determined through tests and experiments. And we learned the network parameters from annotated data. Here, speech, gaze, and gestures are observable behaviors that we had data for, that we could learn the parameters from. And what we wanted to know in particular was that if we had the robot's speech, hopefully a storytelling robot knows a story. Can we actually infer the robot's gaze and gestures from that speech so that we can simulate that behavior? If I had access to one channel, can I actually learn the patterns across these channels to be able to simulate those other ones? So the inference here was, given the robot's speech, can we infer the gaze and gestures? So, our main goal here is to take this kind of simple Bayesian network and let's see, can we actually learn a plausible model such that it creates some kind of plausible behavior, right? We're not looking at very high accuracies, but to achieve a plausible model that reduces the cost of modeling and analyzing and things like that. So I'm going to show you a quick video of the robot's behavior that's driven by this learned model.
The fifth step is pressing. Leave the post of newly made papers overnight in order to drain the water naturally. The next day, place the wet papers between two larger boards and then press with a compressor to remove moisture.
Okay. So again, like I said, our goal here is to see whether this modeling approach creates plausible behaviors at the end that we would normally do through this conventional approach of modeling it ourselves by looking at these patterns, and reconstructing them in representations. So we compared the learned model to a handcrafted model that we would normally do, and also a model with random parameters. It's the same network model, but we basically give it random parameters rather than the learned parameters. And then a speech-only baseline, which is the behavior channel we already had access to. And what we saw is that the learned model and the handcrafted model do very similar across a lot of measures. So they are comparable in terms of the plausibility, naturalness, and expectability, and that kind of measures of behavior. And they were much better than random speech model. And this is kind of the adjectives people use to describe the behavior as being positive or negative. We see a lot more positive in the learned and handcrafted models, not as much in the random and speech on the baselines. Which kind of helped us conclude that there is something that we can actually learn, at least a level of plausibility that people see it comparable to the handcrafted model. Okay, so that was analysis. How do we actually take that data on observations of human behavior and actually put that into representations that we could use as algorithms with robots? In the synthesis stage, what we wanted to do was make improvements in synthesizing robot behaviors for applications. So think about the following scenario, right? So I have this multi-purpose robot that I buy. It's a platform. And I want to actually use that as a receptionist at a dentist's office, right? And I want to kind of sketch out this interaction and such that it kind of has a vocabulary that it'll use. It'll know the kinds of questions that it will get. It will have a set of answers that it can produce. But how do you actually create that interaction? How do you actually explore and prototype that, right? So if you want to do something like that, you start from scratch usually, right? You build a dialogue model, and on top of that, you build all the behaviors. So what we wanted to do here was to take all that low-level implementation out of the picture and give someone who knows nothing about programming robots the ability to prototype this and test this, okay? So we built a tool called Interaction Blocks that provides robot designers to use a pattern language to explore different interactions and prototype them. And again, the key challenge here was to kind of remove that low-level implementation out of the equation and provide them the ability to explore. So to do this, we did something somewhat crazy. We brought pairs of people into the lab and asked them to interact in scenarios that we think are kind of represent the variety of scenarios that people will interact with robots, right? It involved storytelling, or storytelling, interview, instruction, a collaboration, a conversation, and then we looked through all of these, all this data, and again, we collected this data with the same kind of depth, right? A lot of people, lots of pairs. We're looking at different gender combinations and things like that. Then we coded all of these interactions into for sort of the structure that they followed, right? What do these interactions look like? If I want to describe it to someone, what kind of a form it follows, right? So we created these models for the structure of the interaction. Then we looked through these models and identified these common elements that were common across all of these interactions as kind of these building blocks that we can use to construct and synthesize interactions. Okay? So then we built this authoring environment that allowed designers to prototype and test interactions using this pattern language. So the environment had sort of simple robot controls, sort of an extensible pattern library. This is the basic set we provided, but you can extend it in any way you want. A timeline-based kind of scenario development tool to sketch out how we want that interaction to look like. Right? And again, the primary challenge here was that if I provide some pattern, how to actually, set the robot up in a way to deal with that, right? If the designer, for example, put down a question-answer pair, the robot should be able to, produce that question, but also evaluate the answers that it's getting, and all of that has to happen autonomously without the designer having to program anything into it, other than sort of, some sense of what they expect the dialogue to be like. So what I want to show is kind of the scenario that we have for this. How would a designer actually use this? What does it look like? So here our designer is prototyping a receptionist robot, like the scenario I mentioned, the dentist office, based on a paper-based scenario that she created. She is dragging and dropping the different interaction elements and sketching out that interaction. And then this is what the designer testing looks like.
An appointment? Yes, I am. Could you tell me where to go? Upstairs. Thank you. You're welcome.
And this is what that sketch interaction would look like if you were an end user, actually put it in an office for a dentist's office.
Excuse me. Are you here for an appointment?
Yes, I am. Could you tell me where to go?
Upstairs.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, at this point, it kind of handles very simple dialogue. It's kind of a proof of concept tool, but you can imagine how this could be extended into different tasks and add nonverbal behaviors. It does basic gaze right now, but it doesn't do gestures and things like that. Expand the library, but also allow things like branching for interactions, right? If I got this answer, then how do I actually, which information I provide, that kind of thing. So this is kind of a really rich kind of a tool space, method space that's exciting to us. Okay, so the last project I'll talk about is a sort of a novel approach that we propose to evaluate complex behaviors. And I say complex behaviors, I'm talking about, we looked at how gaze was evaluated, right? We designed a behavior and we compared it to baseline behaviors. What if you had a much richer space? How do you actually evaluate these things? Are the conventions method going to help you with that? So, when we design robot behaviors, the goal of the evaluation is usually to see whether the designed behaviors actually create the outcomes that we expect. Right? Often the way that we do this is we compare that design behavior to some kind of baseline behavior. And from an experimental design point of view, we take these the set of two behaviors as this kind of factor with two levels that has an effect on the interaction outcome. We basically test through hypothesis testing whether that factor is in the way that effect is in the way that we're expecting. For example, if we have designed a set of gestures for the robot, we can actually test the presence of gestures against the absence of gestures to see whether the gestures actually add value, get us the effects that we're interested in. But what do you do actually when the space is much larger, right? You have different behaviors that are happening all at once. Let's say that you have 4 types of behaviors. How do you actually test these, right? If you follow the same approach, you would consider kind of each channel as a factor, right? And follow an experimental design where you have to consider a very large number of comparisons and different combinations of behaviors. So from a practical point of view, this would actually lead to 16 different unique behaviors that you have to make comparisons for, right? And anyone who's run user studies would cringe at that number, right? 16 unique conditions. No, we're not doing that. So, and from a theoretical point of view, what this does is that it allows you to kind of turn these behaviors on and off. It tells you what happens at the extremes. And sometimes you can create mid-levels to see how the varying degrees affect the outcomes that you're interested in. But you're limited in how much you can do, and that also increases your number here, right? So how do you actually evaluate when you have a large space like that, right? So from a design point of view, what we would really like to do is to consider each variable in the design space, right? And try to get an understanding of sort of the extent to which each variable affects the outcomes, right? Not whether they affect the outcome or not, but the extent to which. And also what combination of these variables actually maximize interaction outcomes that we're interested in, right? That's sort of the real thing that we're interested in when you're thinking about a complex system of behaviors. So to achieve this, we proposed to use kind of a regression-based multivariate modeling method to jointly evaluate the variables in the design space and how it affects the interaction outcomes. So I'm going to tell you specifically what we did. So imagine that we're interested in designing a set of gestures for the robot. If you look at the gesture literature, you'll see that there are 4 types of main gestures. There are deictic gestures, iconic gestures, metaphoric gestures, beat gestures. And for any kind of given interaction context, you see a different use of these gestures, right? For speech, just kind of a monologue, I might be using a lot of beat gestures, right? But if I'm giving a lecture where there's information, I might be using a lot of deictic gesture, pointing at things. So we want to look at, let's say, this gesture space, design the same set of gestures for robots, and then evaluate certain interaction outcomes, right? How does iconic gestures versus metaphoric gestures affect how much people recall stories, or the robot story, right? And that's exactly what we did in this project to see how this multivariate modeling technique might help us. So following this approach, what we did is that we considered each gesture as kind of the set of input variables, okay? And as I mentioned earlier, gestures and gaze have this kind of contingency, right? You can't just gesture without using gaze. It looks very, very unnatural. So we built what's called gesture contingent gaze behaviors and modeled them as covariates, okay? And then the interaction outcomes that we were interested in as outcome variables. Then we sort of randomly varied the frequency in which the robot displayed each input variable, each gesture type, at every trial of the experimentation, right? We randomly varied each variable. Of course, covariates had to vary according to that, but this is what we're really interested in, okay? So at any given point, the robot might show within the range of 0 to 100%, it might show deictic gestures at 62% frequency, but it might show less iconic or metaphoric gestures. In a different trial, it might have more iconic and beat gestures, less deictic and metaphoric gestures. And we basically did this randomly at every trial. And what this does is it allows us to sample the full range that these variables can take rather than looking at this binary on-off exaggerated points in that scale, right? It gives us much richer kind of understanding of the input space. Then we built sort of regression models to see the extent to which each gesture type predicted each interaction outcome. So I'll show you just a few example results. And one thing that we did is that we built separate models for males and females. And this was informed by our prior work, lots of known studies from HRI that perceptions of gesture and gaze is very different for men and women. So we kind of integrated that into the modeling process. So looking at just a few examples, for example, we found that how much people recalled the robot's story was predicted significantly by the use of deictic gestures, right? And here, the size of the circle and the weight of the arrow shows the size of the effect or the weight of that variable in our model, right? Beat gestures had less of an effect, but only for males, right? Didn't have an effect for females. Here is the perceived performance of the robot, right? Beat gestures were consistently important for both men and women, and for women, deictic and metaphoric gestures were also important. And lastly, for males, what we did is that we had people watch the robot's story and told them to retell the story. They had to re-perform the robot's story. And there's a lot of literature that shows that actually predicts how well they understand and we're able to follow kind of the story. So with that, none of the gestures actually predicted females' performance, but for men, all three types of gestures predicted that performance. So when we actually go back to the literature on human gestures, we see that a lot of these things are consistent with what we see in that literature. We know that deictic gestures actually improve information recall. We know that beat gestures improve your perceptions as a speaker, as an effective speaker. So some of these things are consistent with what we see in the literature. But we also learn new things. Right? And the reason for that is this way of studying gestures is not possible with humans, right? If you tell me now use deictic gestures only 62% of the time, I'm not going to be able to do that, and no one's going to be able to do that. And this is really actually exciting for robotics research that we can actually explore that sort of design space in this sort of parametric way that wasn't possible before. Okay, so these are just examples of kind of the novel methods and tools that we've been developing to improve sort of this process that we're using to explore the design space and hopefully inform design down the road, have designers use these methods and tools. As a next step, you can imagine how this tool could be made, this method could be made into, built into a tool that's very easy to use in a way that it removes all the sort of the modeling aspects out of the picture, but gives you a kind of a, an idea of how well things are working at a higher level. Okay, so the last thing I'd like to talk very briefly about is so this last thread of work where we're interested in kind of taking all these knowledge and methods and can we inform kind of products, real-world products through collaborations, but do two types of work here. One is understand sort of real-world use of robots, robotic products, and then also use these knowledge and methods to inform the design of these products. So a lot of this work is collaborative. Most of them are kind of starting. And what we want to do is take these methods and research that we're doing in the lab, kind of push it out there as much as we can. Very much like the study that I talked about earlier, the hospital delivery robot. This is work that I did when I was here with my advisors. And this is sort of the kind of studies that we want to do in kind of the space of understanding real-world robotic product use, right? And now we have two studies that are in the works that I want to briefly mention. The first one is looking at how collaborative manufacturing robots are being used in industrial settings. So one of my students, Alison Sope, is identifying sites to visit now. She's going to go out to manufacturing facilities in the Midwest and the East Coast to observe them for a while to see how do actually people integrate this into their workflow and how do they actually work with them. And what does that look like, right? How do these actually function in the world? In the second study, we're looking at how telepresence robots are used in medical settings. And that's an area where it's almost finding maturity, right? This is a perfect time to look at that space. So we're identifying sites, and there's one in California, one in Texas that we want to go to. And hopefully all of that are going to happen this summer. And the second type of work that we do in this space is actually informing sort of the design of real-world products. And this is all kind of collaborative work. The first one is we're hoping that the work that we're doing with flying robots will actually inform the design of a lot of the assistive robotic flying robots that NASA is using and building. So this is work that we do with Terry Fong at NASA. One of my students, Dan, has a NASA fellowship, so he's going back and forth and kind of carrying out the studies there and here and kind of trying to inform their development at NASA. And another example is a collaboration I have with researchers in speech-language pathology. And this is researchers at Wisconsin and University of Iowa who are looking at how do you actually provide social skills therapy for people with social deficits. And they focus particularly on people with brain injury and how do you actually kind of retrain them, provide physical and occupational therapy, cognitive therapy. So we've been using robots as experimental tools to understand these deficits a little better. And this is work we're doing under an NIH grant. And what's interesting here is that the design space I outlined earlier for social robots is actually very much like how they think about this therapy space, right? They think about eye contact, the amount of eye contact a person has to build with the other person. If someone's lacking those social skills, how do you actually train them to build the right amount of eye contact? So there are lots of parallels that makes it an interesting application space for social robots. And then the last piece is work that we've just started with Julie Shaw's group at MIT, and I believe she was here a couple of weeks ago. This is applying some of these kind of tools and knowledge that we're using on communication collaboration onto collaborative robots and bringing them into manufacturing settings where manual tasks are being done right now, and how do we actually integrate and introduce robots that use these skills that we're developing in the lab in that setting to better collaborate with people. And this is work that's just starting, but I think it's a very exciting area. And I actually would like to use this opportunity to advertise an RSS workshop that we're organizing on this topic. Anyone doing work in this area, we have a deadline coming up. So to wrap up, that was kind of a brief overview of the work that we're doing at Wisconsin on building kind of human-centered methods and principles for designing robotic products. I talked about exploring the design space, creating knowledge and guidelines for designers to use to better understand what the space looks like. Then development of design support tools and methods to both help us with the exploration, but also help the designers to build new products. And the last one is efforts toward better understanding real-world use and also informing the design of products that are kind of pushed out into that space. So before I close, I'd like to acknowledge that all of this work was done with an amazing group of collaborators and students at Wisconsin and elsewhere. So I'd like to acknowledge their work. And with that, thank you for listening. I'd like to take your questions.
Actually, great help. Most of the robots that you work with have anthropomorphic form, so arms and head.
The social robots do. They're the flying robots and the telepresence robots mostly don't. I guess the telepresence robot is at a human height mostly, but yeah.
And a lot of the challenges for some of us working with robots that don't have that anthropomorphic form, or even industrial manipulators, is the retargeting problem of how do you take something that you learn from human studies and retarget that to a robot, and whether that would actually be effective when you have a robot that's working with a human. How do you envision what do you think? How do you envision your framework sort of fitting into that?
Yeah. So I think, the way that I think about design problems is that you have a design problem. You're given a problem of, I want this robot to better execute or better communicate its intentions or behaviors to people. And what I need to address that design problem is some kind of resource for design, right? That's often, if you look at other design problems, it's some kind of metaphor. You might look at human behavior as a metaphor, as a resource for designing that, right? So a lot of the examples I gave uses human behavior as the metaphor and as the resource for designing similar behaviors for a similar robot. And it makes a lot of sense when there's a parallel set of capabilities. But when you don't have that, I don't think you have to, you follow that metaphor, right? So I think you have to search for the metaphor, and that's part of the design problem. I don't think, that there's the straight answer to that. But one should look for metaphors, and that's sort of, I think the Flying Robot project illustrates that. If we try to actually take a human-like behavior into a flying robot, it's not clear whether that's going to work or not. So we looked at, if I have to animate this thing and show its intentions, how do I actually do that? And if you look at animation, for example, Disney animation, they deal with that problem all the time. So that's sort of the resource that we use for that design problem. So I think each problem is going to have a set of resources and metaphors and idioms and conventions that you can build. And that's sort of a unique design problem. I don't think it's necessarily a retargeting problem. You could try to retarget and see if it works, but I don't think it's necessarily a retargeting problem. I think it's a design problem, it's a design resource problem. Does that make sense?
Sure. I think some of the work that we've been doing has focused on sort of costs as being
right.
A unifying framework that we're all trying to optimize energy, efficiency, and that sort of ties across systems, whether it's a free flyer or it's my own arm moving to grab something. We're all trying to be optimal with respect to some cost metric.
Right.
And that can be manipulated in several ways to produce exaggeration or any other
Yeah.
behavior.
Yeah.
But I agree. This
Yeah.
is like, I appreciate the looks into animation,
Yeah.
particularly, because it seems like
Yeah.
animators have some very qualitative notions of how to optimize this that we could extract and quantify.
Yeah, I think, there what we're looking at is kind of an inspiration or model that we can borrow from another setting to solve this problem. And, using cost as your way of solving the problem is equally valid and potentially, in a lot of times, much better way of doing that. But I think, design problems don't always have a necessarily straightforward one best solution. And I think this shows kind of the, richness of the possible answers you might have to design questions. Do you want to go?
Really interesting talk.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm really excited about your next studies going into real-world uses.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you envision that possibly feeding back into the knowledge parts and the methods and tools parts. How do you think what you learn from the real world is going to maybe change or inform changes to the first two things?
Yeah, very good question. So I think, with a lot of our research and research in my community, we kind of follow certain assumptions on what the model of the interaction is. Is it a peer-to-peer interaction, or is it a master-slave or a tool-supervisor kind of interaction? And a lot of the examples you saw, it's a very peer-to-peer setup. And we might go into the field and see these collaborative robots where people are not seeing it as peer-to-peer, or maybe they're switching, different models. Maybe certain things they see it as a peer, certain ways they don't. I think that might change sort of the model that we're assuming, at least in the research that we do in the lab. So that would change things in a more fundamental way. Or it might be that very practical problems, and I think a lot of the problems with the hospital robot was practical problems that the company actually did a very good job of addressing in their next versions of the robot. And some of the things are bigger problems that we don't actually necessarily have easy solutions to. So I think there would be kind of different levels of practical problems, bigger problems. But I'm excited about seeing what comes out of it. So
you touched a little bit on it with the telepresence robot and the height,
Yeah.
how it affects, let's say, a superior down. But have you looked at other physical forms and how that communicates back, and when you have a physical form along with the emotion?
Yeah,
how
yeah.
that changes the
Yep,
communication interaction?
Yeah, very, very good question. We did actually. We looked at a lot of things. So these things are mobile. What it's different from video conference is that there's the mobility aspect first. The second thing is it has a different, more kind of coherent embodiment. So we did this study where we compared, video conferencing using a tablet computer versus the embodiment, and then we also manipulated its mobility, like who is controlling it. What we found is that this increased, we call it strong embodiment. When you have a telepresence robot that has a more concrete embodiment, that improved a lot of aspects of collaboration over the tablet computer. So the strong embodiment actually improves collaboration. To our surprise, what we found as far as the mobility was that we had either the remote person controlling the mobility of the robot or the local person controlling the mobility of the robot. We found that when the local person was controlling, the collaboration was much stronger. And that's, contrary to the design of these things now. They are remotely, operated because it gives people freedom. We did another study where we looked at what happens when you have, fully a stationary system versus a mobile system, and what kinds of tasks in which it might make a difference. We had like a task that was very small in a contained space versus distributed. We found that mobility actually didn't make a difference in the constrained task. In the big task, it actually hurt. And that actually underlied a lot of the design problems that are there in the product controls. People felt lost. They had to constantly reorient themselves and that kind of thing. So there are lots of interesting things there. Once you introduce mobility into a video conferencing system, actually bringing in kind of any kind of robotic picture into any system that we're used to actually fundamentally changes it, and we're not aware of that. I think we take it for granted. Sometimes people call these telepresence robots Skype on a stick. And I think it's an understatement because it's much more than that, right? Many more things happen when you have that ability to move that changes the interaction. I'm happy to tell you more about those studies.
So great talk.
Thanks.
In your analysis tools section, I was particularly struck by this video of the robot explaining the story and gesturing at the same time. And the gesture that really struck me was the wooden board thing. It's talking about two wooden boards and it did something like this.
So how does it know to actually
How is it-
explode?
And so it's sort of the fact that your model was able to associate that gesture.
No, so let me explain that. It doesn't do that. What we did is that we defined the modeling problem in two spaces, so two levels. One was kind of at the feature level, and one was at the domain level. At the feature level, we know what type of gestures that we need to generate, but we don't know the specific motion. And that the motion is looked up from a table given that type of gesture through matching some kind of semantic table. So going from that speech to the actual motion is doable. We'll probably need a huge amount of data, a much more sophisticated modeling technique. So by kind of dissociating those two, the problem, breaking the problem into two, and dealing with the feature level, and kind of doing something simpler on the domain level allowed us to see whether this is this is even a promising technique. But I think that would be a really good space to look at, and doing that jointly I think is a really tough problem. So, but thanks for catching that. That's,